back on it when Buck left the show. And the other thing was that Buck...
Roy Clark, one of the finest country musicians and entertainers of his era, passed away at 85. While his death brought deep sadness, what shocked people even more were his final words. These were not casual remarks. They were words with a hidden message. What has Roy Clark revealed to the public? Join us as we unveil the last words of a legend. Roy Clark's final message before death. Roy Clark is making the headlines years after his death, but this time, it's his undecoded final message that's making the waves. At 85, Roy Clark lived a remarkable life as a Country Music Hall of Fame inductee, television personality, and multi-instrumentalist. Even in his final days, he still kept his guitar close, performing and making people smile until the inevitable happened: death. While no one can escape it, what struck people most was that his last words reflected the same spirit he carried throughout his life. Roy was known not just for his musical talent, but for his kindness. Those close to him described him as a kind man with a soft heart whose cheerful nature went beyond the Hee Haw stage. However, many believed Roy was underrated and never got the recognition he truly deserved. Roy himself never seemed concerned about that. He knew the impact he had made, and he remained focused on doing more. Before Roy's passing, those close to him said he had shared these words: "The next chance you get, do something nice for somebody. Say good day, hold a door open, and don't wait around for a thank you. You don't need it." Even at the end, Roy's message was one of kindness. He encouraged people to keep finding ways to brighten someone's day, just as he had always done for others. But as often happens, death came for one of the kindest souls among us. But what were the events that led to Roy's death? Let's find out. It began like any other morning for Roy and his wife, Barbara. They were enjoying a quiet time together at home when trouble struck. Pneumonia. Roy began to struggle for breath. Alarmed, his family tried to act quickly. They called for help, hoping to get him to the hospital in time, but the illness had advanced too far. In his Tulsa home, surrounded by love, Roy Clark took his last breath. Barbara wept, holding on to their son, who also cried as he tried to comfort her. It was a crushing day for the entire family. When the public was informed of the cause of Roy's death, many were surprised. Only then did people begin to realize that Roy had quietly battled this illness for years. Soon after, more details of his health struggles began to emerge. Roy Clark always had a smile on his face as he performed, right up until his last breath. Only a few days before his death, he was still on stage at the Grand Ole Opry, doing what he loved most. Yet behind that cheerful public image, Roy was fighting private battles with his health that almost no one knew about. He endured chronic fatigue for years, often feeling drained, no matter how much he rested. Recurring infections in his bronchial tubes caused this constant exhaustion. No matter how carefully he tried to manage the condition, the infections kept returning, sometimes forcing him into the hospital for several days until he recovered enough to return home. But that was not his only struggle. Roy also lived with severe back pain, an issue that began in his early touring years during the 1960s when constant travel and hours on stage put tremendous strain on his body. The pain sometimes grew so unbearable that he had to cancel certain performances, something he disliked doing. Still, Roy kept showing up. His schedule was relentless. He performed nearly every day, or at least 6 nights a week. Performing was not just work to him, it was his passion, his joy, and his source of fulfillment. Roy Clark could not stand to be idle without playing the banjo or guitar, so he kept going. His family worried. They noticed he was coughing more often and struggling to breathe, eventually needing to use oxygen regularly. They urged him to slow down, but Roy refused. Close friends also noticed the decline, yet whenever they expressed concern, he would brush it off, insisting he had everything under control. Occasionally, when his health truly left him no choice, he canceled a show to rest, but those moments were rare. Somehow, Roy always found a way to push through and appear at the Opry or other venues, no matter what. Through it all, he brought smiles to countless faces. Even in pain, he remained dedicated to music, mentoring younger musicians and performing whenever possible until he passed away in his Tulsa, Oklahoma home. When news of his death broke, the public was devastated. Many were stunned to learn pneumonia had claimed his life. Only then did one of his close friends reveal more about the health challenges Roy had kept hidden. Victoria Hallman speaks on Roy Clark's health. Victoria Hallman, a fellow Hee Haw star who had known Roy for decades, shared her memories in an interview. She recalled the chills she felt when she heard Roy had died. However, she knew Roy had back trouble, but she thought that was his main issue. Like many others, she assumed his exhaustion came from constant travel and the demands of performing at his age. They never suspected he was battling something far more serious, as he was always smiling and making everyone laugh. Victoria also added that she knew the weather had been cold in South Tulsa, so she had probably thought it was the change in weather that affected him and that he never quite recovered from the chill. But the shock she felt later was in learning that he had been dealing with these illnesses all along. Roy Clark had always been a private man when it came to his health issues, so it seemed he did not want everyone worrying about him, especially since his wife, Barbara, was already weary at home from caring for him and managing the household. Victoria also recalled the time when Roy had surgery for his gallbladder. They had been worried about how it might affect him, but the operation was successful. Only a few days later, he was back on stage, performing for 2 hours, and the audience loved every minute, unaware of what he had been through. She also recalled an even more serious occasion when they thought they had lost Roy, as he had become so ill that he could not walk at all. They feared it was the end for Roy. However, Roy appeared in the doorway, walking slowly with the help of a cane. As he entered the room, everyone smiled with relief and joy, and Roy immediately began joking with them, lightening the mood in the way only he could. Still reflecting on their friendship, she said the last time she saw Roy was during a memorial service honoring a Hee Haw producer who had passed away. They had exchanged pleasantries, talked, and laughed about old times, but little did she know it would be the final time she would ever see him. Victoria said that when she first arrived at the memorial, she saw Roy already singing and playing the guitar. His music calmed everyone in the room and helped lift the heaviness that hung in the air. She smiled at him with pride in her heart, remembering how, during the initial gathering, he had struggled to move about. Yet here he was, on stage, playing without a thought to his discomfort, entirely focused on giving the audience his all. His natural voice, which she believed was a gift given by God, rang out strong and pure, but she could not have imagined that this would be their last meeting. Victoria also spoke about Roy's humor. She said he was a man who seemed to have been born funny and always found ways to make people laugh, especially during their days on Hee Haw. Even through his most difficult health challenges, he never failed to step on stage and sing with all his heart, because music was his greatest passion. Roy Clark was a lovable soul who never raised his voice at the people he worked with, and no one had ever complained about him. "I'd never met a stranger," Victoria added, noting that this was one of his favorite sayings. Roy believed everyone wasn't a stranger, but a friend. This belief was evident in Roy's relationships with others, as he could make people feel comfortable. Following the announcement of Roy's death, fellow celebrities mourned the passing of this great country music star. Keith Urban tweeted that his very first CMA memory was of sitting in his living room as a boy, watching Roy Clark perform in such a way that it got him up on his feet. The Grand Ole Opry also paid tribute, thanking Roy for the years of laughter, kindness, and positivity he had brought to the stage. They even shared one of his most beloved quotes: "Do something nice for somebody without waiting for a thank you." The general public reached out to console the family, sharing heartfelt memories and condolences. Many said that Roy Clark was part of their childhood, recalling evenings spent watching Hee Haw with Roy and Buck Owens performing one of their many hit duets. Some said that Roy's death marked the end of an era. However, others expressed disappointment and anger that, although Roy was one of the best country musicians of his time, he didn't receive the widespread recognition and fame that he deserved. Yet, Roy Clark was a legend as he lived his life without necessarily seeking the recognition of people. But how did Roy's story journey begin? Let's take a look back at the story of Roy Clark's rise to fame. Roy Clark's background.
22 years. I remember.
I tell everybody I've grown old on that show, but I could have grown old without.
Roy Linwood Clark was born April 15, 1933, in the small village of Meherrin in south central Virginia. He was one of 5 children born to Hester Clark, a poor tobacco farmer, and his wife, Lillian Clark. Life in Meherrin was both simple and challenging. There was no electricity in the home, which meant no radio and limited access to modern entertainment, but music still filled their lives. Hester and his brothers played instruments together, and young Roy was never far from the sound. By the time he was 4 years old, Roy was already playing the tenor banjo. One of his brothers played the mandolin, another the fiddle. These instruments belonged to their father, and the boys would gather around to make music together. It was their joy and a form of connection in a time when luxuries were scarce. In those early years, guitars were not yet part of their home's collection. However, the boys learned to play the instruments they had by ear and proved to be naturally gifted. Whenever there was a community event in Meherrin, Roy and his brothers would be found performing, while other children ran around playing games. Roy was captivated by musical sounds. He loved them so much that they became a part of him. However, his musical gift was likely inherited from his parents, as his father was a semi-professional musician who performed at gatherings, and his mother also played the piano. Roy's parents eventually left Meherrin for Grafton, West Virginia. They stayed there for a while until his father found work grinding precision lenses at the Washington Navy Yard. The family then moved into a house provided for workers. Roy was happy in this new place because they had electricity and a radio. This exposed him to a wider range of music than he had ever known. He liked it and soon realized that music was far more than what he had experienced back home. His father sometimes taught him how to play different instruments when he returned from work. City life, however, had its challenges. Washington was always a noisy place, and the constant commotion troubled him as a child. During the summers, he would go back to his uncle's house in Meherrin, where he would play the mandolin. While at home in the city, he continued to play the banjo. Around 1943, Roy's next-door neighbor, Johnny Schwartz, noticed the boy's interest in music. He often heard Roy playing his father's mandolin. One day, Johnny invited Roy into his apartment and showed him his guitar. Roy was stunned. This was the first time he had ever seen one up close. It was a Harmony-manufactured Wayman. When Roy strummed its strings, he felt a sudden jolt, like lightning had struck him. In that instant, he knew the guitar was the instrument he wanted to master. By the time Roy was 14, he was playing the banjo, guitar, and mandolin. Years later, after Johnny Schwartz passed away, Roy was given the very guitar that had first inspired him. One Christmas, Roy asked for a Silvertone acoustic guitar. He received it, along with a complete set of chord books. His father tuned it for him, and Roy began practicing every single day. He played until his fingers bled, then soaked them in ice water to numb the pain before playing again. At age 15, Roy began joining his father at square dances, playing alongside him and earning $2 for his performances. This not only brought in a bit of extra money for him, but also sharpened Roy's skills. In 1945, Earl Scruggs was becoming one of the top banjo players in the country, revolutionizing the way it was played. When Roy heard him, he was hooked and began taking his banjo lessons more seriously. He studied under Smitty Irvin, who would later join Bill Harrell's Virginians, a well-known DC area bluegrass group in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Roy played not for money at first, but because the music itself fascinated him. Yet he didn't have a quality banjo at home, and money was tight. When he managed to save some money, he would visit the local pawn shop and buy a guitar, learn to play it, then trade it for a mandolin, and later swap it for another instrument. This constant exchange of instruments became his training ground. As Roy later said, "If it weren't for the pawn shops, I'd still be hung up on just one guitar." Roy had many favorite musicians in Washington, D.C., and he frequently attended their performances. Afterward, he would steal them blind and lick. The musicians became aware of this habit, and whenever he showed up, they would cringe and say, "Here comes the kid again." In 1947, Roy won the National Banjo Championship. His skill was unmatched for someone of his age. At age 16, Roy made his local TV debut on the WTTG country program alongside his father, where he sang Eddie Dean's hit ballad, "One Has My Name, the Other Has My Heart." The heartfelt performance encouraged him to keep pursuing a musical career. The following year, he won his second national banjo title, but by then, he had already begun playing the fiddle and the 12-string guitar. Despite his talent, Clark was a shy person. He hid his humility behind humor, using it to mask his awkwardness. In school, he was often isolated because many of his classmates disliked country western music. Humor became his bridge to fitting in, and later, it became part of his stage act. Still, he would not feel truly confident until the mid-1960s. After completing vocational school, he obtained a work permit that enabled him to work in venues serving alcohol. He also signed with local promoter Ralph Case, who booked square dance bands into clubs and military bases. That connection led to an opportunity in December 1949 for Roy to play at Baltimore's Hippodrome Theater in a week-long Grand Ole Opry stage show, headlined by Hank Williams and the Drifting Cowboys. Roy's career as a musician began to blossom, but he had a backup plan. He played baseball and also boxed, just in case music did not work out. As a boxer, he won 15 straight matches and was hailed as one of the most promising amateur fighters in the region. Still, music kept calling. Roy spent hours with his guitar, telling jokes between songs to keep audiences relaxed. Eventually, he left boxing to focus solely on music, sometimes playing from morning until daybreak. After clubs closed at 1:30 a.m., he would head to after-hours venues and jam with black musicians, often playing blues. These clubs, however, were regularly raided every couple of weeks. Roy was arrested more than once, paying fines before heading right back to playing, until he finally stopped visiting them altogether. Roy Clark, the rising star. In 1951, Roy won first prize in the banjo category at the National Country Music Contest in Warrenton, Virginia. The award included a plaque, a trip to the Grand Ole Opry, and $500, which he used to buy a Fender Broadcaster guitar, although he admitted feeling guilty for using banjo winnings to buy a guitar. The following year, he placed second in the same contest, but was already making a name for himself. He became close friends with Foyle Smith, Marvin Rainwater, and Jimmy Dean. When Dean's song Bumming Around hit the national charts, he invited Roy to join his band, the Texas Wildcats, in 1954. Dean promoted Roy heavily, making him lead guitarist, but Roy's chronic lateness clashed with Dean's strict punctuality. Eventually, Dean fired him. After leaving Dean's team, Roy reflected that he had never intended to be just a country guitarist. He wanted to play whatever felt right to him, without being tied to a single genre or forced into television appearances. However, he continued performing in clubs. Sometimes he played solo, other times he backed other artists on guitar, including Marvin Rainwater, who had taken first place on the popular CBS program Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts, the American Idol of its day. Roy kept entering talent contests, determined to make himself known. His persistence began to pay off, and in 1960, an opportunity appeared that would change everything. The turning point. In Washington, D.C., the bluegrass music scene was thriving. The Country Gentlemen, Red Allen, and other well-known names played every Tuesday night at a club in Georgetown called the Shamrock. Roy often went there to watch them. He saw them grow, and he saw people like Charlie Waller, who was once a parking lot attendant who sang Hank Snow songs with his guitar in the booth, become one of the leaders of the bluegrass movement in D.C. But Roy wasn't chasing a bluegrass career. He was busy hosting local TV shows and performing at clubs like the Rendezvous and Strix. Staying in his lane proved wise because one night, while performing at Strix, he caught the attention of someone who could change his life. That night, Wanda Jackson, the rockabilly pioneer and Capitol recording artist, was in the club with her father. She was facing a dilemma. The Golden Nugget in Las Vegas had offered her a regular spot, but she felt she needed a new bandleader to open and lead her shows. While discussing it with her father, they were drawn in by Roy's stage presence and his skill with the guitar. They were impressed enough to offer him the job immediately. Wanda's manager immediately took Roy on as a client, saying he believed in Roy's talent and wanted to be part of his career. Capitol then asked Roy if he wanted to record for them, and he accepted without hesitation. While working under Capitol, Roy met Hank Penny and his band. Hank liked him instantly and hired him even though he didn't technically need another guitarist. Hank also took Roy under his wing, helping him refine his comedy skills. This was something that would later become part of Roy's signature charm. In November 1961, Penny and Roy traveled to Hollywood to record Roy's Capitol debut LP, The Lightning Fingers of Roy Clark. It was a lounge-toned showcase of his lightning-fast picking. But tragedy struck when thieves broke into Roy's station wagon and stole everything, including his prized Les Paul guitar and amp. Hank lent him a Jazzmaster and a Vibrosonic amp, which Roy posed with for the album cover, even though he never played it. Despite the setback, the album earned solid critical praise and above-average attention from fans. Roy continued playing, and in 1961, Jimmy Dean, who had once fired him for chronic lateness, had become famous for his country pop hit, Big Bad John. Dean was also an established network TV personality, serving as a guest host for The Tonight Show in New York. He tracked Roy down to a club in Stafford, Arizona on Wednesday and told him he wanted him on the show by Friday. It was a major opportunity. Roy wasted no time arranging a flight to Manhattan and arriving on Friday morning. He did not see Dean until about an hour before the taping. Dean asked Roy how many songs he had written, and Roy replied, "Maybe 2. Dean grinned and said, "We'll do 2. If that doesn't get him, we'll do 2 more. This prime-time exposure on stage with Dean brought national attention to Roy's sound and boosted his album's recognition. Roy released his first vocal hit in 1963 titled Tips of My Fingers. However, he left Capitol 3 years later after his final album with them. The decision was partly due to his frustration with the Gibson Birdland guitar he used on tour. It was a fragile instrument that was easily damaged by airline handling, despite Gibson frequently replacing it. Outside of music, Roy admitted he had more consistent success in television than in any other medium. He was a regular guest star on the Beverly Hillbillies. Then, in June 1969, he was approached to co-host Hee Haw alongside Buck Owens. The program was originally intended as a one-off summer replacement, but it struck a chord with viewers, and the team wanted Roy Clark to co-host Hee Haw permanently. That same year, Roy's recording of French pop singer Charles Aznavour's ballad, Yesterday When I Was Young, reached the country top 10. The song's popularity led to cover versions by artists such as Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, and Dean Martin. In the early days of Hee Haw, Roy had doubts about the show's musical fit. He felt his and Buck's bands did not blend naturally, but the producers reassured him. Eventually, the band lineup was adjusted. The show went on to run from 1969 to 1993, becoming a cultural fixture. Roy's influence on the show was irreplaceable and incomparable to anyone else, as he helped introduce the Hugh Hugh gospel segments. He worked on the Hee Haw show for years, and one day, an opportunity came knocking. One day, someone suggested Roy appear on the Grand Ole Opry. Instead, he decided to recreate his Meherrin, Virginia front porch on the Opry stage, performing alongside his family and friend, Bob Schott, on banjo. It was a heartfelt moment, still remembered by audiences. Within a week, Roy secured an Opry spot, a Hee Haw appearance, and an album for ABC. Roy Clark's Family Album, a collection of traditional standards, became his best-selling record. By the early 1970s, Roy was the highest-paid country music entertainer in America, earning $7 million a year. He won Entertainer of the Year 3 times from both the Academy of Country Music and the Country Music Association. The CMA also named him International Friendship Ambassador in 1976 after his groundbreaking tour of the Soviet Union. In 2009, he was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. Roy lived in Tulsa with his wife, Barbara Joyce Ruppard, until his last breath. However, he had been married before to Ruby Conley when he was 17. Roy and Ruby had a child together called Roy Linwood Clark Jr., but the marriage ended in a divorce in 1957. In the same year, Charles married Barbara Joyce Ruppard, and their marriage has been blissful ever since. He credits his success in music to Barbara, who has been a supportive presence in his life. Roy revealed in an interview how Barbara would drive him from one gig to another during the early stages of his career. Barbara and Roy are blessed with 5 children. However, Roy performed less frequently, slowed by arthritis that affected his thumb, which forced him to adjust his playing style on the banjo and guitar. "Music is my salvation," he once said, refusing to quit altogether. Some of Roy's favorite lines when he ended his Hee Haw show were, "Before we go any farther, I want to lay something on you. It's not heavy, and it's not to imply that you don't already do it. It's just a reminder." To all of us. Another one, which he said most often, was, "The next chance you get, do something nice for somebody. Say good day, hold a door open, and don't wait around for a thank you. You don't need it. And because of you, that person will go out and do something nice for somebody, and then that person will do something nice for someone else. And this whole world can wind up doing nice things for each other, and we can be the ones that start it." Roy always ended his shows with the love rap, which he recited to his audience in a sincere tone that resonated deeply with their hearts. Roy Clark died in Tulsa on November 15, 2018, at the age of 85. He was buried at Memorial Park Cemetery in Tulsa, with a public celebration of life service held on November 21 at Rhema Bible Church in Broken Arrow. Roy Clark's story began as a shy boy living in Meherrin with no access to electricity or radio, and he went on to become one of the most influential country entertainers in history. Today, Roy Clark is remembered as the man who didn't just sing, play the banjo or guitar, but as a man whose life touched the hearts of many. Roy Clark's story is an inspiration to many country music musicians and fans worldwide, reminding them not to give up on their dreams and to keep chasing them. What do you think of Roy Clark's final words before his passing? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.